Yeah, when I was at Keurig Green Mountain, this goes back to in the year 2007, I was managing the company's supply chain community outreach efforts. And as our funding was beginning to ramp up, the company had a policy of contributing 5% of its pre-tax earnings to projects in communities where we did business. And about half of those funds were put to work here in the States around facilities where our employees lived. The other half was put to work in our coffee supply chain. And I was just coming into this role of managing these funds that were directed in our supply chain, to our supply chain. And I felt like I didn't want to use, even though I'd spent months actually living in coffee communities, doing volunteer work, I didn't want to use my own anecdotal experiences to base decisions around funding on. So we asked CIAT, the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, to help us better understand what was going on at the household level in parts of our supply chain, Nicaragua, 2 departments of Guatemala, and 2 states of Mexico. And I remember going with CIAT in 2007 to Nicaragua to interview farmers at the household level. They had developed a questionnaire with 22 questions. Some of the questions pertain to the family, some pertain to their coffee, and some pertain to just life in general. And one of the very last questions was, did you or your family have any periods of extreme scarcity of food in your household? And if so, what did you do about it? And I remember my first interview very vividly, as if it happened yesterday. And it was with a woman who was probably in her mid-30s. And we got to that very last question. These interviews lasted about an hour, and we get to this last question, and she stopped, she paused. I could see tears welling up in her eyes. She reached in her pocket and pulled out a yellow cloth to wipe the tears away. And when she was able to compose herself, she said that she and her family had 3 to 4 months of extreme scarcity of food in their household every year. And it relates to what Marcella was saying. Some of it is cash flow, in the sense that, you know, at least in Nicaragua, in Central America, the harvest generally begins October, early November, and ends the end of February, beginning of March, depending on altitude. And by May, at some point, most of the farmers' earnings from coffee are largely depleted, which puts them in a position, just as the rainy season's beginning, of having very little cash to buy food. Most of these farmers are 100% or very close to 100% dependent on coffee for their earnings. Many of them, you notice, didn't have even a family garden. They were used to buying everything that they need, including their own sustenance, with their earnings from coffee. So they would either eat the same diet but consume fewer calories every day, just eat less. They would eat less expensive foods, perhaps fruits and other things that grew on their land, or things that they could obtain through their community. Or they would borrow from friends, neighbors, or their cooperatives, and repay that debt during the next coffee harvest, entering, in a sense, a cycle of debt. And that, I think that's when we began at Green Mountain, and also with Food for Farmers, to look for ways to help farmers not be entirely dependent on coffee. Certainly not this isn't anti-coffee by any means. It's a very important part of the household income, but not to be entirely dependent, not to have all of their beans in one basket, so to speak, because it's risky. You've got things like climate change, you have things like drought, that are affecting in the dry corridor this past year, that was leaving people hungry, leaving people having no other choice than to migrate, to leave the coffee lands. And so we have found that, and certainly Lutheran World Relief is also very focused through its activities on helping farmers maintain a healthy livelihood, a resilient livelihood through diversification, where we work in coffee and other products. But it's very, very important, particularly for the well-being of the supply chain. And when we stop and think about it, farmers are the foundation of the business that we're in. And when you think about building when you start about constructing a building, and you start building it on a foundation that has cracks and is weak, that doesn't bode well for the future of that building. So it's really important as an industry, I think, to do everything we can to keep that foundation as strong as possible. And I think efforts with Rural Relief, Food for Farmers, and other organizations are making a difference at the real foundation.